monitor, which is fine. She works at home more than me.
Okay. Well, we have the recording, so I think we can begin. So it's an honor for us to receive here at the Philosophy and Biology Study Group from the Institute of Bioscience from the University of São Paulo, Charles Pence, who will talk to us about the rise of chance in evolutionary theory. The title of this talk is the same title of his book, which we read during this semester with the group. Charles Pence is a professor at the Université Catholique de Louvain in Belgium, where he directs the Center for Philosophy of Science and Societies. He also serves as a co-editor of the journal Philosophy, Theory, and Practice in Biology. His work centers on the philosophy and history of biology, with a focus on the introduction and the contemporary use of chance and statistics in evolutionary theory, the very subject of this talk. His lab is also one of the foremost groups integrating this work with methods of the digital humanities, and is increasingly engaged in the ethical implications of biological science and technology. So, Charles, thank you once more. We are really pleased to have you. And so we will hear your presentation, and then we can have a really informal debate on the subjects. Thank you again.
Perfect. Thank you, guys. Let me get this screen share going. 1 second. Is that? Yes. Okay. And full screen. No, not full screen. Presentation mode. All right. Does that look good?
Yeah, great.
Cool. Awesome. And then let me start a timer so that I don't talk too long. So yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me, especially, gosh, for those of you who read the book, thank you so much. I really do appreciate it. Yeah, this was a long time in the making. Well, we can talk more afterward about kind of the sort of life story of the book, kind of how I got here. But yeah, let me start by backing up and say a little something about the motivations. So sort of what was the problem that I first got interested in that made me want to think about this in the first place? And it comes out of what I think is a fairly simple observation. When you read The Origin of Species, one thing that I think makes The Origin of Species so fun to read, and I recommend it always to everybody, is that it actually still seems pretty modern, right? You read The Origin, and The Origin is very readable. The Origin makes sense to a contemporary audience. Okay, it's not how we would write now, but the arguments all seem reasonable enough. Except there's a few things that stick out, that don't seem reasonable, that don't seem like the way we would do it now. And one of those things that has always really struck me is that Darwin manages to introduce the whole theory of evolution. He goes 400 pages with no formulas and no graphs, no math. There is one, as you probably know, one phylogenetic tree. It's not even actually real phylogenetic tree. It's a sort of schematic phylogenetic tree. That's it, right? By the time just a little bit later you get to the early 1930s, you have things like, this is Sewell Wright's famous first fitness landscape, right? Mathematical model of a population that's moving through a hypothetical fitness space. I surveyed a bunch of evolution textbooks when I was starting the project, and you can't get 30 pages in a contemporary textbook in evolution without a formula, without a graph, without a distribution, without something like this. So what happened, right? How did we get here? Why, when, and how did we make this change? And that's the central question that with a bit more precisely than that. As I make it more precise over the middle chapters, how did we move to a statistical theory of evolution? And that theory could let us understand the action of natural selection across generations at the population level, which then could be harmonized with Mendelian transmission. So all these shifts on this slide, these all happen over the first 50 to 75 years of the history of evolutionary theory. And that's a big set of changes. That's a lot of things that get radically different really fast. And so trying to understand and explain that shift, that's the goal of the book. So those of you who've worked in history and philosophy of biology, and so I know many of you haven't, I'll be a little quick here, but there is a sort of standard, or there was a sort of standard answer to this story. And so I want to quickly try to contextualize my work before I move on. The classic source here is Will Provine's Origins of Theoretical Population Genetics. It's a great history. It's also got some nice technical developments about how we got to contemporary population biology. I'm going to caricature it a bit here, but hopefully in a way that I think at least comparatively sort of helps illuminate what I'm up to. The classic story goes something like this. First, we have Darwin. Darwin tells us a story about adaptations in individual organisms. There's not much focus yet, right, in Darwin on populations, you'll notice. And Darwin is a staunch evolutionary gradualist, right? Change always happens very slowly, really small adaptive steps. Both of those ideas, but especially the gradualism, are picked up by the biometrical school, which is typified by Carl Pearson and W.F.R. Weldon. But then also working in what we might call an anti-Darwinian school around the same time, anti-Darwinian because Mendelian. Bateson and others rediscover the work of Mendel, which focuses on large jumps initially, right, instead of gradual evolutionary change. But, and this is the story, Bateson, Pearson, and Weldon get so occupied fighting with each other that really nothing comes of this period, right? Fisher and Wright, for their part, sort of go back to the beginning. They rediscover in Darwin everything that was really useful, and the rest of it sort of falls by the wayside. And you see this pretty explicitly in some of these histories, right? Here's Provine saying, well, look, people fighting just meant that we couldn't get to the evolutionary synthesis until the 1930s. Or Alfred Sturtevant, right, very well-known population geneticist. This is what we in history of science call an actor's history, right? He writes with this bit of like nostalgic regret that the personal quarrel delayed the utilization of the powerful methods of statistics in much of genetics. And so in short, what I want to do is argue against this classic history. Two quick caveats before I launch into the arguments from the book. The first is just to say that this is not a history of mathematical statistics, right? And that has been done elsewhere by other people better than I could do it. I am not a good statistician. I can make my way around some 19th century statistical works, but that's about it. Stigler's work prior to 1900 is great. Ted Porter in the era after 1900 or even before 1800 is also great, but that's not me. What's also not me, although this is worthy of debating later on, what's also not me is that this isn't a history of eugenics. And this is a bit more of a tendentious, difficult choice. As you may know, there's an extensive body of work on the history of eugenics already extant. It's very good. It's a bunch of very fine scholarship. Many of the authors that I work with, Galton, Pearson, and Fisher, most especially, right? These are the most important figures in the history of eugenics. And that's really important. And I think it's worth thinking about whether or not sort of I dealt with that appropriately and enough in the book. But in any event, I didn't want to write another history of the development of eugenics in Britain in the late 19th century. I think that's been done again better than I could. Okay, so enough with what other people have already done and what I'm not going to do. I can talk more about that in the Q&A if people are interested. I can sum up the main project of the book in quick slides. So the first is just to say that there's a lot of really self-conscious theoretical work being done by Darwin, Galton, Weldon, Buell, Fisher at the very least, because they're conscious that they're doing something that no one's done before. They're conscious that they're introducing varieties of probabilistic and statistical reasoning into the sciences that weren't there. And that led them to be very careful. That led them to do what to me is surprisingly rich philosophical work that they thought they had to do in order to justify the reason to do their project in the first place. And those philosophies of science, sometimes they're understood by philosophers, sometimes they're studied by philosophers, but actually quite often they're not. And so sort of a sort of pleading for the importance of that philosophical work is half the book's project. And the other major thesis that falls out in the process of looking at those philosophies is I think that they show us there's been a lot of ink spilled about the idea of a Mendelian revolution, the idea that we sort of remade biology over the course of the 1910s and 20s as we reintroduced genetics to evolution. And I think that's too hasty. And I think that a story about continuity is actually much more confirmed, better supported than a story of revolution, at least about these questions of chance and probability. Maybe there's other places, like in agricultural breeding, for example, where revolution is the better way to understand what's happening. But here in chance and probability, anyway, I think the name of the game is continuity. Of course, to be sure, there's a real, interpersonal conflict here, as I think you saw in the reading. Some of these guys really hated each other, right? These guys were not friends. But that doesn't mean that we can't see past that to a lot of really interesting, I think, intellectual common ground. So let me see what I can do to sort of hit the highlights of that story in 20 minutes, just to sort of remind everybody, or at least perhaps to show you what I now think were the important bits, and to sort of kickstart the Q&A. If one of these is particularly interesting to you, right, don't hesitate to ask in the Q&A. I have lots of bonus slides. I have extra quotes and stuff. So yeah, really don't hesitate. So obviously we start with Darwin, maybe not obviously, but I mean, this is what the vast majority of historians of science would do in this kind of context. Darwin is interesting, I think, because he's not actually very systematic about how he uses these chance and probability related concepts. I see at least 4 notions in Darwin's work, and I could probably add more if you pressed me to do so. First, Darwin's really interested in the idea of accident as opposed to design, right? Chance, something about being chancy is about being undesigned, arriving without a plan. He is clearly aware of something like what we would now call the law of large numbers. That is to say, at one point he talks about the idea that if a family is really large, then rare traits will be more likely to appear in it, right? This is just a sort of classic probability reasoning tool. He's aware of that, although he doesn't put it to that much use. He's also, of course, very famously aware that natural selection is not an exceptionless law. It's not like Newtonian gravity. It's a tendency. Things with higher fitnesses, things that are better adapted to their environments, will tend to do better than things that aren't. They won't always win. And he's conscious that makes natural selection a very different kind of scientific theory than many others that we've seen before. And lastly, he talks about chance when he talks about the fact that we're just ignorant of the precise causes of lots of variations, right? Very often we don't know what it is that has caused a particular variation to emerge in a population. This is part of him acknowledging that he doesn't have a mechanism like now we would describe Mendelian genetics, with an understanding of mutation rates and DNA and all that good stuff. Right now, we feel like we have a better idea of those precise causes. Darwin didn't. But what matters for Darwin, I think, is that all of those notions chance. All of those times that Darwin is willing to make space for some fancy in his theory, they're constrained They're constrained by the fact that natural selection is paradigmatically not chancy. Natural selection generates order. Natural selection generates adaptations. Natural selection is this kind of quasi-rational process that produces all of these characteristics that are so interesting in the living world. And so we can let chance in all we want, no problem, at other levels, because whatever it is that chance does at those levels, well, it's going to be contained by the action of selection later on. And I like this quote from the Orchids book, because it's Darwin at work, right? So he says, the flowers of orchids in their strange and endless diversity of shape, when you compared with the great vertebrate class of fish, or still more appropriately with typical homophorous insects, which seem to us in our ignorance as if modeled by the wildest caprice. So sure. It looks awfully chancy, it looks awfully random, but that's just because we're not keeping natural selection in mind. If we keep natural selection in mind, we're fine. So that sets the stage for Francis Galton. Here is Francis Galton. Galton reads Darwin. Galton is Darwin's cousin. He reads Darwin in his middle age, and then he just dedicates himself almost completely to trying to understand heredity and later eugenics. Galton's also a huge fan of the Belgian statistician Adolphe Quetelet. Pester me about this in the Q&A. This is actually my next history project, so I'd be happy to rant about it. I think this is a really cool connection. Galton draws much of his statistical inspiration from Quetelet, and that for me makes Galton interesting because he's a kind of paradoxical figure. On the one hand, Galton is widely regarded as not being very good at doing science. So, here's a quote from Bernard Norton's PhD thesis. Norton says, the argumentation concerning, in this case, Galton's idea about natural ability was, as frequently with Galton, very bad. But the concept was powerful, if vague. And I really hope people don't write about me like that after I'm dead. A little bit much later on, Richard Swinburne, funny, Swinburne's now known as a metaphysician, metaethicist, but Swinburne originally wrote on the history of biology, and he writes that, again, for talking about now about natural inheritance, he claimed this law, which implied to unimportant characteristics like stature and color, could not account for evolution. His argument is quite extraordinarily bad. And that's really we're not pulling our punches. Now, this, I think, is really obvious if you read Galton. He has all these bad habits. He'll often be giving you a really nice biological or philosophical or conceptual argument for a claim. And right when he gets to the really interesting part of the argument, he says, oh, and so let me explain this because I built a box. And if you put balls in the box, then you'll see that I'm right. And it's like, no, we were talking about biology. We weren't talking about balls in a box. So Galton has really wonky arguments. On the other hand, he's extremely important. He makes a huge splash. He changes the work of an entire generation of British biologists. And so here's Pearson talking, to be fair, in the Life and Letters of Galton book, so maybe he's being a little bit biased, but he says this elsewhere as well. No one who studied natural inheritance, Galton's magnum opus from the late 1880s, on its appearance and had a receptive and sufficiently trained mathematical mind, could deny its great suggestiveness or be other than grateful for all the new ideas and possible problems which it provided. The methods of natural inheritance may be antiquated now, but in the history of science, it will be ever memorable as marking a new epoch. This is weird, right? How could he be doing bad arguments but change the entire course of this history? I think the way to square this circle, the way to make sense of this paradox, is to say that Galton was extremely adept. He put his finger directly on two really important open questions in Darwin's theory. Two questions that you have to fill in if you're going to make a general purpose statistical theory of evolution. And the first of those is, so how exactly is statistical evolution connected with the transmission of characters from parents to offspring? So it's Galton who's the first person to think about the idea that, well, wait, if we get statistical distributions in populations, maybe that's somehow related to the fact that there seems to be statistical distributions that relate offspring to parents. Perhaps we can put those two things in dialogue. And Galton's the first person to have that idea. His theories about it are good, but he realizes that that's the kind of question you're going to ask. He also wants to figure out, how can we recover evolutionary dynamics from a statistics of normal distributions of characters? So if you know statistics from the late 19th, you'll know that what impressed Quetelet was the fact that every year the statistical distributions look the same. Species look the same. Populations, people, demographics tend to look the same. So where does dynamics come in? Again, Galton doesn't have an answer to this, but he realizes that this is the kind of thing that you're going to have to be able to deal with. Time is running, so I'm going to jump over looking at how those two things appear in Galton's famous quincunx device. If you're interested in one of these crazy physical models, I don't know if you've ever played with one of these in a science museum. They're actually a lot of fun. I'm going to jump over this for now. We can come back to it in the Q&A if people are interested. Those open questions then are really seized upon. Sorry, the image is shifted. They're sort of staring at us from the bottom of the slide here. These questions are picked up by what we now will call the biometrical school. So this is an elderly Galton on the right, and on the left is Carl Pearson. And then this is W.F.R. Weldon, who I always love showing pictures of because he looks like a character from some old Western movie. And their research project starts out by picking up on the second question, right? They're really interested in this question of evolutionary dynamics. How do we show natural selection happening in a population in the wild? And this is the graph that is widely cited as being the first graph to have done that. That is to say, in a population of crabs, Weldon notes that there's a non-normal distribution for a character. He works with Pearson to factorize that non-normal curve into the sum of two normal curves. And then he says, well, look, that must mean that selection is splitting these into two subpopulations and driving them apart. And we actually now think that was probably right. Very hard to know, but probably right. And then back that up with a bunch of careful longitudinal studies. So they do a bunch of very fine-grained quantitative work here. One of his colleagues notes that there's a difference between the way that the male crabs seem to be responding and the female crabs seem to be responding. And then they try to give a causal story to this adaptation, right? So they don't just want to say, oh, well, here's natural selection. They say, well, no, look, there's a mechanism here. That is to say, the crabs were picked up in Plymouth Sound, and Plymouth Sound is everywhere, and especially near here, becoming yearly muddier, so that the number of dredgers necessary becomes yearly greater, the fauna yearly more scanty. And so the idea is that there might be a selective advantage to changing this character in this way, shrinking the distance across the front of the crabs, that would improve a kind of filtration efficiency and perhaps let the crabs survive better in extremely muddy water. So that's the physiological hypothesis for the adaptive change. And they back that, oh, here's crab. This is one of the little small diagrams from Weldon's notes. The idea is supposed to be the arrows are showing the points at which Weldon thinks the water is passing through for filtration, and so shortening that top edge of the crab could make that more efficient. And then I don't have the image here. They proceeded to do real physiological experiments. That is to say, they set up crabs in pots and tried to change their environments to see if shortening the fronts of the crabs really did have an effect on filtration. It seemed to have such an effect. So they really tried to do a sort of what to us seems like a really nice broad-based study of adaptation, right? They found a population shift. They looked at what might be physiological or environmental pressures that could lead to the population shift, and they tried to back that up with a physiological story. And the whole thing held together, right? And this was their program up and until the rediscovery of the results of Mendel. And so this is a famous image from Weldon's 1902 paper where he's looking at peas. The argument here actually is actually that the P characteristics that Mendel had said were very binary actually seem to have much more continuous character variation than you might have thought. So you have green on the left, on the top row, you have green on the left and yellow on the right, right? Mendel says that's binary. Weldon says, look, I have P's that seem to be a little more yellow and a little bit more yellow and then yellow. How are we gonna sort these? But more broadly, what the rediscovery of Mendel pushed them to do was turn back to that first question. So if Mendel's going to radically change the way that we think about the transmission of characters from parents to offspring, now we need to tell a story about how that character transmission could make sense with natural selection. The thought that Weldon then had from 1902 for the rest of his career, which unfortunately was only 4 years, he died in 1906 of an illness and largely overworking himself to death. This was a very good thing for me to study. I was studying this when I was the same age that Weldon was when he died. So I was telling myself, okay, don't work so hard. You really don't. You really could accidentally kill yourself. Weldon really thought that we would be able to build a statistical theory of Mendelian transmission that then could encompass all of the statistical work about natural selection that they had done in the last few decades in their research group. And he actually thought we'd do it by turning back to some of the resources that Galton had given us. As he says here, good old Galton, STIRP is still the only machine which will work, and the proper line of research is an inquiry into those embryonic stimuli which make a given character evident or latent. That is my fixed belief. So he thought, look, Mendelian dominance might be a kind of special case, but we should be able to get back an understanding of, excuse me, these normally distributed characters. A bit further on, he even links this to early work on chromosome theory, which was just starting to be widely disseminated in cellular biology in the early 1900s. Now, as you probably saw, the big problem here is they just don't have the mathematical tools to do this theory. So, this is Weldon's last equation, last biggest, ugliest equation. It doesn't work. It doesn't give you the results that it should. It's a hypergeometric distribution, which just isn't manipulable. He doesn't have the math that he needs. But this is finally all the ingredients that we were looking for when I started, right? This is a statistical theory of evolution that would let us understand the action of selection at the population level, which could be harmonized with Mendelian transmission, right? That was Weldon's sort of final life goal. There's just one problem with which I want to wrap up, and that is, if I argue that this project is a failure, then why should we think it matters? So Weldon's project doesn't work and then he dies. A bunch of this work is in an unpublished manuscript, or at least for now it's unpublished. I'm working on a critical edition of it. In the book, I offer 3 stories about that to explain that intellectual continuity. The first is to say that a lot of works did advance parts of this program, but not the whole thing. The second is to tell a more detailed story about George Udney Ewell, who had a sort of early synthetic approach in the early 1900s. And the third was to look at the textbooks of evolution from this period. I'm not going to talk about the first 2 at all, and I'm only going to talk about the second one really fast. But I looked at 3 textbooks, one by Robert Heath Locke, one by J. Arthur Thompson, and one by E.S. Goodrich. And what's interesting is that what you find there is not a story of revolution, not a story of incompatibility or open warfare. What you find are careful, reasonable presentations, both of the biometrical work and of the Mendelian work. But you don't find a conflict. You find a genuine desire to unify biology, largely in the way that we've just been talking about, right? About how can we get a theory that will let us, if you will, have our cake and eat it too, that will let us have both an understanding of Mendelian transmission and of natural selection. And so that takes us to Fisher, who's the last character in the book, obviously right here in the last, 2 minutes of my talk. Fisher is weird and complicated. Fisher's own thought is delightfully strange. It's a complex, unstable, maybe contradictory. A new paper just came out by Brian McClune arguing against my presentation of Fisher in the book, saying I should have just said Fisher was contradictory. But it's a mix of eugenics and Christianity and indeterminism and really, really, really refined statistical method. And making sense of Fisher is really a lot of work. It was some of the hardest reading that I did for the project. But the important thing for my purposes here, at least with respect to this story about continuity, is that Fisher is trained in this very textbook tradition, and he reads the biometrical literature. He knows all of this stuff. So it's not like Fisher was going back directly to Darwin and reinventing the bits of Darwin that seemed to make sense. Fisher knows this stuff. And so by the time we get to Fisher's genetical theory of natural selection in 1930, we have a statistical theory of evolution that's a decent approximation of contemporary population genetics. So I haven't been able to give you the full story today, but I hope I've helped remind you of the broad outlines. There's really interesting and rich philosophy of science going on in these authors. They're thinking really hard about why they made the methodological choices that they made. The subtitle of the book, A Pompous Parade of Arithmetic, you probably saw, right? It's a critique that Weldon once received. Someone said, look, you're just telling us with a pompous parade of arithmetic things that we already knew, right? And they were worried about this. They thought this was a real critique. This bothered them. They really thought that their work needed to be bringing something new. And so they worked really hard to demonstrate what that novelty would have looked like. And again, there's a really nice story of continuity here, I think, that's obscured by the easier story about revolution and interpersonal conflict. So with that, happy to take questions. Also, the book has a website. There's teaching materials on the website. There's cool stuff on the website. Go check out the website. Yeah, feel very free to get in touch. And I'm really excited to chat with you guys about it more.
Great. Thank you very much, Charles. Thank you also for keeping on time for us to have time for chat. So we are open for questions and discussion, both for people who have read the book with the group and for people who just took account of it with the presentation. And I will give the place to Roberto. I think Roberto is described as to be the first. O Roberto Rosenberg, você vai falar, não? Sua mão está levantada.
Eu gostaria de começar perguntando.
Great.
Posso?
Of course.
All right. Thank you. Thank you very much for your excellent talk. I have 8 questions, so I'll probably choose. Yeah. So, well, I'll start with James Costa. He's talking about chapter 2 of The Origin of Species, and he says that Darwin was very excited about the patterns that emerged using a rule of 3 proportional approach. So I noticed that you didn't mention it in the book and in your talk, but that's about chance, isn't it? Although it's not statistics, it's all about chance, right?
Yeah, there's a couple more. So a few more things in the time since I wrote the book. There's a couple more kind of proto-statistical things in Darwin that I am now more aware of than I was when I wrote the book. The first is exactly this. It's some of this botanical methodology that he gets into to try to understand distributions of species in genera. And that is interesting stuff. I'm still not entirely sure what I think about it. There's a really interesting paper. I'll out myself. I was peer reviewer on it by Andrei Ariev that came out, I think, last year, where he tries to really argue that some of Darwin's usage of that kind of work, and a couple of things in some letters, really indicates that Darwin sort of had a statistical mind. And I can't go with him. I can't go that far, but I haven't yet really figured out what I think the right interpretation of that kind of line of work is. It is cool stuff, and it also puts Darwin in contact with another context that I think is important that I also didn't talk about. This I do talk a bit about in the book, which is this kind of German-speaking plant breeding, flower hybridization, plant breeding context. It's interesting because that's also right. That's Mendel's world, right? Mendel's best read is coming out of this kind of what's up with flower hybrids? Flower hybrids are strange. So that whole world is really interesting, and there's probably a really neat story to be told about how Darwin and Mendel both link back into it, but I don't know what the story is yet. But it's a great question, because I think it's a really cool, I think we're to say about that.
You said you had several questions, Roberto. Do you want to make another one?
All right. Okay. The second thing, I had a personal reading that you was kind of an unknown hero of, the early days of modern synthesis, because I'm talking about George Yule, okay? But then I found this paper by James, it's not James Costa, James Tabery, and I don't know him, but he's talking that Yule was more a reductionist than he was more into a reduction of it instead of a synthesis. So do you agree with that?
I disagree pretty strongly with Jim's paper, and I know Jim well. First of all, I caught an error in his math. That's in the book. But I really do see Yule as animated. Rachel Ankeny did a paper on Derbyshire 20 years ago, maybe, that gets at a little bit of this. I think if you think about the sociological context for Yule, you see him go publish in this weird journal. Well, now, I mean, of course, it's actually really funny. The New Phytologist is now like one of the most important journals in all of botany, right? All biologists have heard of it. But in 1902, it was this like weird new thing that nobody had ever heard of. And it was sort of independent and like free thinking. And I really think he's trying to, he can't publish in Biometrica because he doesn't want Pearson to get mad at him. And he can't publish in the Royal Society because he doesn't want Bateson to get mad at him. So sociologically, I think he wouldn't be trying that hard if he didn't have this idea that, gosh, guys, if you'll just stop yelling at each other, you really are kind of doing the same thing. I think it's the sociological argument that really shows that was his motivation.
Do you want to ask still another question, Roberto?
Maybe I come back later so other people can ask.
Great. Maria Alice? Okay, I will ask a question and then pass over to Maria Alice. I would have a broad question, Charles, because, well, we saw that in your book you give a big attention to the biometrists, in particular to Weldon, arguing that there is much more continuity between their works and the general synthesis and the modern synthesis than what is generally thought. And I will have a double question regarding this. So firstly, of course, it's not simple to do a contrafactual history, but do you have any thoughts about what genetics evolution could have been if Weldon lived longer, or if such personalities as of Pearson and Bateson were not so combative in a sense? I imagine that working on Weldon's manuscript, you were thinking perhaps about this. And secondly, related to this, what impact could this view of yours of the history of genetics and evolution could have on education? We know that Gregory Redick has been working on this, and I would like to ask your opinion. how do you think we should change our teaching or our initial teaching on genetics and evolution according to your thesis of continuity?
Yeah, great. So yeah, I mean, you anticipated part of what my response was going to be to the first question, which is go read Greg's new book, which, here. It's even on my desk. Go read this. It's going to be great. I haven't even read it yet. I'm desperately behind to give a book review of this to a journal. I'm going to take it. I'm going to take it to the beach with me this summer. So Greg really works on the counterfactual history, and I think in broad outline he's right. Let me maybe pick up on some things that actually. So okay, the 5-second version of Greg's basic idea, for those who've never run across his presentation of this, is that Weldon, being a lot more interested in the interaction between organisms and their environments, between traits and the environment, a Weldonian genetics might have been able to be a little less genocentric, to be a little less gene for X kind of stuff, right? All this stuff we try to get our students not to think, right? The gene for being gay, like, no, stop. That kind of thing, right? Greg's idea is that maybe a Weldonian view would sort of reduce the way your brain thinks that way when you see Mendel and you see that there's the gene for green and the gene for yellow and the gene for smooth and the gene for wrinkled, right? That Mendelian classic presentation of Mendel tends to have you think the other way. I do think that's right. What I would add, and I don't think Greg gets as much into this, but this actually does come from, as you mentioned, it comes from the manuscript. Another thing that's really interesting is that Weldon is deeply worried, deeply motivated by questions in what we now would probably call molecular and developmental biology. And so if you go back and look at this manuscript, so of course, one of the classic narratives of the modern synthesis is we all stopped doing development, right? We all quit caring about, we threw development out, and it didn't come back until Evo Devo. Weldon in 1906 has an entire chapter on what regeneration means for development and evolution. And that's really, really cool. It seems completely unexpected, shocking, and interesting to a 21st century reader. That this hyper-mathematical, who you might otherwise think hyper-reductive, kind of, mathematical, statistical bio nerd guy. No, he's really worried about what does it mean for evolution that hydras can regenerate parts. And that's, maybe you get a softer modern synthesis. So that's the other counterfactual that I would sort of tentatively offer, is maybe you get a modern synthesis that's more open to things like development and molecular biology. And you don't have to wait until, or not molecular at the time, cellular, right? But you don't have to wait another 50 years to get there. As far as how this might impact education, the hat that I'll put on then is actually this is sort of a sales pitch, because this is what I do so I promised the NSF when I got money to write the book. I was still in America at the time, so I had an American grant to write the book, and I promised them that I would do some teaching materials to go with the book. And what I do in the teaching materials, because I still think this is a really cool thing to think about, one thing that I see in this period is smart, careful, intelligent, professional scientists who make the same kind of mistakes that our students make, because they're easy mistakes to make. So things like, the big ones, what's the right way to think about teleology? What's the right way to think about directed evolution? What's the right way to think about, trying to remember what the other case studies are. It's been so many years. It's been too many years now. But the idea is that a lot of sort of preconceived notions about evolutionary theory seemed really reasonable to practicing biologists in the 19th century. I think it's a really cool way to show students, like, look, you're not stupid, right? You don't. This isn't a it's not a dumb mistake that you made, right? No. You had a thought that a bunch of really famous biologists also had. Turns out to be wrong. Here's why it turned out to be wrong, but that's a totally normal thing. And I've always thought that was a really interesting way to think about kind of helping our students deal with a theory that's not easy, right? A theory that's not it's hard for us to remember that it was hard to get your head around this the first time you heard about it. Now it's second nature to all of us, right? I'm like, sure, of course, why wouldn't natural selection make sense? So that for me is one of the big lessons that the late 19th century can offer education practice. A little sprinkling of history might help our students feel less alone.
Great, thank you. Marielice?
Thank you, Charles Pence, for your talk. It was wonderful. It's nice to see you today with us.
Marielice,
we had a good time during this last weeks reading and discussing your book, and so it's a pleasure.
Now it's good.
It's cutting.
Now it's good.
Yeah, computer. Well, I was just telling how much how it's pleasure to meet Charles Pence, and how it was wonderful to discuss and read his book. I am going to ask two questions, both from your presentation, one from the last answer you did, and the other from your presentation. You mentioned quickly the Galton's quincux device. And since we discussed it a lot in our meeting, I would like to hear you talking about them. And the second question is just, you mentioned here by now that you think it's important to give a right way to think about teleology in the teaching of evolution. And since this is a very cool theme that is all recent books in philosophy of biology have one or two or three chapters in teleology, and since this is a kind of a contentious theme among some of historians and philosophers of biology, I would like to hear your opinion on it.
Okay, the first question is much easier than the second question. Let me reshare my. Or actually, well, no, I probably should reshare. Hang on. Let me try to get just to that slide. Scrolling. Here we go. Just to be safe. 1 second. Screen share. Hello. Go ahead. Make sure it's going. Okay. So here's the figure that you've seen this before. So yeah, you've probably played with one of these before. So if you were discussing this in the course of the reading, then you know. But for those of you who haven't, classic science museum demonstration on the left here, right? You put balls in the top into the funnel in the one labeled figure 7, and you get what you see at the bottom. You get a normal distribution. Now, Galton already is a bit weird about this, because Galton already notes, right? So Quetelet has a very easy. He doesn't talk about this particular machine. He doesn't build one. He's not a machine builder, but he has an answer for what this would mean, how this would work, right? And it's the same answer that we see in the way that statistics is applied to astronomy. Namely, well, look, there's a bunch of small errors. right? So if you imagine the course of one ball, it smacks one pin, and that will give you a little bit of error. It'll make it go a little bit left or right on the average. And you add those up, you add up a bunch of small errors, you get a normal distribution. But this is just a crude analogy, right? This doesn't tell us how this works in the actual living organisms. And so Galton notes, like, on the one hand, this means we need a theory, right? Where he owes us a theory for, so how are character traits like balls in the machine? And that theory also needs to be, it's not just a direct or simple or straightforward analogy. It's more than that, because precisely the point of what gives you the normal distribution is that those little impacts are small. If the impacts are big, then, well, the normal curve won't arise. It's not, the theory's not going to work. So that also creates another problem, because what are, how to put it, most kinds of changes in development, most kinds of problems that can befall an organism, what we would now talk about as mutations, although they wouldn't have talked about them this way, right? Most variation, this is big changes. This is life or death. This is survival or not, reproducing or not. These aren't small. So he also owes us a theory about whatever it is that's going on with those character traits, how does that, in turn, actually act statistically? What does it take for that stuff to actually act statistically? So there's your first problem. That relates to this first open question, right, about the transmission of characters from parents to offspring. He wants them to act like the balls in the machine, but he doesn't quite know how to do it. And you get the same problem with the dynamics. So another thing that you'll notice if you look at the machine in figure 7 on the left is that you go from the funnel at the top, which is very narrow, to the distribution at the bottom, which is very wide. So if you keep doing that generation after generation after generation, you're going to keep increasing the variance without limit. The curve's going to get wider and wider and wider and wider. That's not what happens. Populations, organisms are pretty stable. So he's forced to do really weird stuff, like introduce this thing in figure 9 where he says, well, look, okay, so it falls down the machine, but then it just sort of gets squeezed at the bottom. By what? We don't know. Something, some kind of biological force must be squeezing stuff, squeezing down these distributions so that the variance doesn't just go up forever. But he doesn't have a story about this. He doesn't want to tell us, he doesn't know how to tell us, he doesn't want to tell us, he doesn't know how to tell us a story about how those characters will actually act that way. So I think this is just a nice analogy for the way that Galton's reasoning, you know, he gets to the right question, but then he just can't quite figure out how to get to an answer. It's just he doesn't have the tools. He doesn't have the tools he needs. So there's the Quincunx story. Teleology. So part of what I can say here is I think a very nice way to introduce the problem is to go back before Darwin. I think what I do in the materials online, if I'm remembering rightly, is I do it with a bit of Lamarck to try to at least show them that you even still sometimes see in bad textbooks, especially at like the primary level, that evolution is when things really want to eat the high leaves on the trees, right? I mean, you will still see that every once in a while, unfortunately. So I think beating down that sense of teleology lets you open the door to the more interesting questions, which are precisely, yeah, I mean, they don't have answers. It would be wrong to say that we can give students the one correct answer to these questions. There isn't one, but at least we could tell them, look, sure, we do though want to say that the long neck is for eating. That seems right to almost anybody. What we mean by that, though, it gets very, very deeply and profoundly complicated. I'm always reminded of Darwin's own confusion about higher and lower forms of adaptation, right? This was the kind of issue that Darwin himself never really quite knew how to resolve. And I always find those really compelling to give to students, to show them that the great heroes didn't have all the answers, and sometimes we still don't have all the answers. I think we do them a real service when we say that.
Okay, yes, I agree. Thank you.
Nélio? Ainda não estamos te ouvindo. Nélio, you are without sound.
Sorry about that. So, can you hear me now? Yeah? Right, great. So first of all, congratulations for your talk and your book. So we have been reading it for many sessions, and then you were here among us for a long time. So it is great to see you now in person, even if remotely. But I have two questions actually. So one of them is part of my homework. So João Cortese gave us a long homework. So I have a long question that I have to read. But instead of that, I may present this question later. But anyway, a quite short one. Related to the fact that you mentioned that you did not want to rewrite the history of eugenics in Britain, right? So I'm not claiming that you should have done that. But my question is, all these examples of Quetelet's distribution, so this came to Galton's mind because of the measuring of people that he was doing, So my question is, how can we understand the transition between the Mendelian school and the biometrical genetics without taking in consideration all the huge amount of data that these guys had? And particularly, I would like to ask you, how well known would have been Ronald Fisher without the sponsoring of Leonard Darwin? Would he have been so important? Would he have been so? And so, are we talking about what? Not about eugenics. So, how can you deal so keeping apart a whole amount of facts and data that were important for the theory? So this is my question.
Good. Yeah. No, a difficult question that I'm happy to talk more about. There's a few things to say. I'll take those backwards. The Leonard Darwin question is really interesting. I am inclined to think that sooner or later, Fisher's technical innovations in statistics would have brought him to the attention of the broader community. Now, it probably happened faster than it would have because he had this sort of weird patronage thing going on. But I think when you look at what he did at the Rothenstedt Field Station over the course of the 1930s, I just don't think anybody, or 1920s rather, I just don't think anybody who produced all that stuff was going to stay under the radar. That's a lot. And that wound up being useful for so many people in so many branches of biological practice. So now, yeah, as you said, would he have become immediately a sort of founding figure of the modern synthesis? That's an interesting question. I mean, there is, how to put it, I am also very conscious of the fact, this is a third caveat that I could have added but didn't. It would be cool to write another book that does the same thing, but from 1930 to 1960 instead, right? That is also an extremely, incredibly interesting story. And there's a little bit of that work that's been done already. There's a book chapter by Anya Plutinsky and some collaborators trying to look at chance in the modern synthesis. But that story hasn't been told yet. And I am not a specialist on most of the synthesis authors. And I'm not even really a specialist on Fisher after 1930. That's how weird Fisher is. I've had to work hard enough to get to 1930. That's a good segue though, because I mean, another thing that I think really strikes you when you read Fisher's work is that for Fisher, eugenics is just another evolution problem. So you read the genetical theory. So after the modern synthesis, there is a real tendency. People try to take the genetical theory and cut the eugenics chapters off the end and say, like, look, you can just read the beginning, right? And everything will be fine. And that doesn't work at all, right? That clearly doesn't work, because when you go read the book, Fisher, he introduces the basic theory about how mathematical genetics might work. And then he says, look, there's some problems with this theory. Mimicry seems hard. How's mimicry going to show up? A few others, I forget what are the other ones. And and by the way, there's another problem with this theory, which is why aren't we all Babylonians or Egyptians? Because those were successful cultures and they should have fixed. So we should all be speaking either Babylonian or Egyptian. And for him, it's not like, and that's, I mean, this is what I always try. It's like, it's not like you turn a page and he's like, now I will talk about people. No, it's like, this is another biology problem, right? This was a good trait that should have gone to fixation. What happened? It's exactly like he's thinking about mimicry or green peas, right? Totally the same. So in that sense, for someone like Fisher, I think you're absolutely right. And yeah, especially if I had kept going in Fisher discussions, you have to figure out how to deal with that more head on than I did. Before him, things get murky. Things is kind of weird. So part of why I didn't want to spend too much ink on this is because of how kind of ambivalent. So when you read the Pearson-Weldon correspondence, one thing is actually kind of sticks out, and I've read almost every letter that the two guys wrote back and forth between each other that still exists. So a lot of letters from Weldon to Pearson, because Pearson kept everything, and not many letters in the other direction because Weldon didn't keep stuff, unfortunately. You find, and Margaret Morrison has written a couple of articles on this, you find a surprising separation between eugenic concerns and what we might call biological concerns, much more than you might expect. So it's not as though, I don't want to paint either of them in a positive light. Let's be very clear. Pearson is despicable. It's actually very difficult. It's a hard book to write just because, except for Darwin, all of these people were pretty uniformly terrible. Just bad people. Weldon seems kind of okay. Pearson's a god-awful human being, very obviously. But when they talk about biology, they talk about biology, and they seemed to think that, at least this is the best reconstruction that I can give of it. They seem to think that they needed to support their eugenics by demonstrating their work in the non-human context. So whenever they get really worried about, it's very interesting. When they're just talking about doing some statistics, they'll trot out Quetelet's, soldier chest measurements, or Weldon has this. Weldon and Galton both have this height of all Englishmen curve, right? That they love to talk about. So they'll use human examples, no hesitation at all. But then when they really get down to brass tacks, they go out into the backyard and plant flowers, or they collect snail shells, or they pick up crabs, or they tend not to turn to sociological data, which really surprises me. I don't have a great explanation for this. that's Pearson and Weldon. I'm moving backwards. For Galton, of course, that's not true at all. Galton floats back and forth between the two all the time with no compunction whatsoever. But that I think is obvious. That is obviously true. That probably does come from this Quetelet inspiration. Now, Quetelet's not a eugenicist, as best I can tell. At least I've never seen any. I've read a lot of Quetelet, and I've never seen anything. I mean, he's interested in statistics about data that could be used eugenically if you wanted to. So he, talks about marriage statistics in Belgium and gives it weird moralizing casts about how, people don't get married enough anymore and whatever. Like, okay, but it doesn't seem eugenicist. It just seems weird in 19th century and moralizing. But obviously the two, evolution and eugenics, breeding, maybe is the right way to say this, breeding is a unified thing for Galton, I think. I think he thinks of agricultural breeding, evolutionary breeding, and human breeding as just clearly the same kind of thing. Probably that means I should have done more with Galton's eugenics in the book than I did. In hindsight, as I've worked more with Galton since, because I continue to be interested in Galton. Is just such a weird figure. That probably means that in particular is probably the biggest weakness there. I think there's more story to be told. But yeah, it winds up getting strange and kind of case by case, surprisingly quickly. Long and meandering answer, but hopefully somewhat illuminating.
Just to add another word, I'm not sure if you are acquainted with the debate among historians of science 32 years ago, back to the early 90s, about if Charles Darwin had man in mind when writing Original Species. So this was a great deal of the discussion. So maybe we have something similar here, in the transition between, so we maybe we have to take into consideration, the consequences of all these theories to marriage, to, isolating people and not living. Are you familiar with the book wrote by Leonard Darwin, The Need of Eugenic Reform, 1926? So he writes at the beginning, he's very grateful for the work, for the revision done by Ronald Fisher. So you see how things were,
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, Fisher is often cited, I think quite justly, as perhaps the only consistent eugenicist ever to have lived. That he tried to have as many kids as possible and grow and raise chickens, and he was a very weird guy. So yeah,
Darwin did not have any offspring.
No, yeah, Galton. I've always thought that was I bet some letters were burned that were really interesting. That's all I'm going to say about Galton. I have my suspicions about Francis Galton. Let's just say.
Roberto?
Hi, I'm back. So I guess two questions is fine. I'm curious about Pearson. He was 73 when GTNS came out. Did he read it? What was his impression? Can you comment on that?
Very little documentary, as best I can tell. After about after about 1909, so Pearson trickles out a few more evolution-related things after Weldon's death. But after about 2009, he never really seems to pick up anything related to evolution again. And the best evidence I have, the only evidence that I really have, I've combed through a little of the correspondence. I could probably be more thorough to really answer this. It's an excuse to go back to University College London. But this lecture that he gives near his retirement in the early 30s, and it's after GTNS comes out. And it just seems, it's like a time warp from about 1910. It seems to have no idea that anyone has thought about any of these questions, like since Pearson put his pen down 20 years earlier. It's a bizarre thing to read, even because of how sort of out of time it is. So as best I can tell, he just became a pure eugenicist after about 1909, 1910. Just weird. It's very odd. But yeah. And of course, I'd love to have more of a biographical explanation for that, but Ted Porter's biography of Pearson stops too early. Porter's biography is great, but it doesn't do the back half of Pearson's life to speak of. It kind of trails off. I mean, Pearson just gets much less interesting. Like having studied Pearson, I kind of understand why Porter did that. Like you get through the kind of high Weldon years, and it's like, and then he just does eugenics record office stuff until he dies. Which is not that exciting. But yeah, we don't even have a good scientific biography that deals with those years.
Because Pearson was also one of the few who probably could understand GTNS, right?
Exactly. I mean, it would have been really interesting. I mean, it doesn't help, right? It doesn't help that very early on, Pearson decides he hates Fisher. And of course with Pearson, like that's a lifetime blacklist, man. You're done. You're out. You're off the team. And so I think that's also probably part of it. That he read what Fisher, some of Fisher's papers from the teens about the method of moments. And those papers from the teens, Pearson's just like, you understand what we're doing. You understand our methods. You're a bad statistician. It's just like, well, okay, they're done. They're done.
Right, last question then. It's kind of counterfactual, but when I teach quantitative genetics, I show the students that if you have incomplete dominance, you have 1 to 2 to 1, and it starts forming a normal distribution, right? So you go up from 1 gene to 2 genes, then 3 genes, and then by 4 genes, you already have 9 classes, and you have a normal distribution, right? But Correns only, when did Carl Correns showed incomplete dominance? And if he had shown that earlier, do you think it would become clear to them that it was all a matter of the number of genes involved?
I'm blanking on the date. There's also, so that immediately, of course, becomes a matter of hot debate, right? So you'd need both, like, when did he show it, and then when did people really start to believe him that it was really a thing? And I think those are going to be separate by at least 5 or maybe even 10 years. You do, I know for sure, by the time you get to East in the 19-teens, right, with the Mays genetics stuff, that it gets pretty clear. That's like a 7, if I remember right, gene network that gives you whatever, how many rows of kernels you have around your corn. So at least you know you have one example, and that's widely confirmed and widely distributed. Now, then, what I don't know, this is another. Yeah, this is. It's a great question. I don't know much about the sociology about that result either. So, I mean, there's also in that period a natural reaction to East's results would have been, yeah, well, but you know, plant genetics are weird, because people love to say that in that period, right? If it wasn't demonstrated in some kind of classic model system, you didn't really know it, right? So that's a great question. I mean, I do think the idea that at least theoretically larger numbers of traits or large numbers of Mendelian factors contributing to an expressed trait would begin to reproduce something like a normal distribution is well understood by the mid-teens, the mid 19 teens somewhere. But yeah, as to whether that, I mean, it didn't really seem to impact model construction for a while.
Can you repeat the date, the dates you said? It was well understood by?
Let me get the F3. Let me get the date on the quiet dinghy. Yeah, so East's two papers are 1910 and 1913. Two big papers coming out of the Maze genetics project. And that, I think, like I say, whether or not, surely, I think probably some theorists were like, you know, corn's weird. But I think at least it would have been recognized as a theoretical possibility by that point, that if you really saw something that you were sure looked normally distributed, you could appeal to a large number of characters.
Marilis?
I see that we have a little time, and if nobody has another answer, I would congratulate your work, Charles, also for being this for doing this valorization of continuity and discontinuity in the history of biology, this historiographical point, because people that are not familiar with the history of science in general, but know, of course, the works of Thomas Kuhn, for instance, tend to think that we always have these revolutions. So I think it's wonderful to have such deep research like your one, showing that continuity and discontinuity are always together, and so it depends and varies. So it's more a general comment, and an eloge for your work.
But I'm actually happy to rant about this for a second, because this is really, I mean, this is actually something that I've been really interested in since I wrote the book. So one of the first times I did a talk like this, right after the book came out, somebody asked me something like, do you think that you looked for this just because you like continuity? You know, like, is that like, did you just like kind of want to find that, or for that matter, which I think, you know, an equally a really serious question, as kind of an HPS methodological point, history and philosophy of science methodological point. Is it just that if you take any period like this and you zoom in enough, there's a stealth cat on the desk in front of me. He's solid black. Will you always see continuity, right? Well, do revolutions go away if you just get into the details enough? And I don't know. I think it's a really, really good question, and I don't have a strong opinion about it now. on the one hand, like, I feel like saying yes is kind of a cool answer, although that makes my book like less innovative because it just means, well, of course you would have found continuity because I zoomed in really far. But I do think it's a really interesting, it is a really interesting kind of methodological point to think about, like, what does it mean to find a revolution or to find continuity? And I want to think more about that, although I don't know how. But I think it's a really interesting kind of for us studying these things. Yeah, I mean, obviously, you know, we all live in the shadow of this history of science that tells us that, you know, what matters is the Copernican revolution and the Galilean revolution and the Newtonian revolution and the Darwinian evolution and the chemical revolution, and I could go on. That's how I teach history and philosophy of science to my bachelor students. We spend weeks doing, here's a bunch of interesting revolutions and what they meant for, you know, it makes sense. But yeah, so I methodologically now I think this is like a kind of a cool open idea. I don't know what to do with it.
Thank you.
Yes, so we are running out of time, but still, Nélio, I think we will have a question, and perhaps if someone who didn't talk yet wants to make another question, then we can sum up. Nélio?
If nobody else can ask a question, I have my homework here. I can read my question, which is exactly about this issue. So, because, well, you wrote, it's about the Mendelian revolution or the quiet synthesis, you know. So maybe that somebody could ask you, are you against revolutions? So, but you wrote, I think it is profoundly important to see that there are at least some viable interpretations of evolutionary theory on which the Mendelian revolution was gradually taken in stride, right? So I want to ask you, what do you think about, you certainly know James Crow's article about this history, this period of history. So he wrote that before 1918, there was an explicit conflict between Mendelians and biometrical genetics in Britain. But he added, curiously and fortunately, such controversy did not cross the Atlantic. So you were talking about East's results, right? So American geneticists took for granted, they had taken for granted that continuously varying traits were determined by the cumulative effects of Mendelian factors, whose individual effects were too small or too obscured by environmental influences to be measured. And then he concludes saying that, and then between the end of World War I and 1950, the three giants, as he calls them, Haldane, fission, right, completely dominated the field. So are we talking about a smooth path leading to the compatibility between the two systems, or a huge gap, geographical gap, you know, that we had, you know, a drift, let's say, a drift effect, you know, in the States, right? So I want to listen, what do you think about that?
Yeah, great. I'm gonna two things to say. First, yes, I have, that's another thing that's not in the book that should have been. It's interesting to note, I was just pulling this up. So most, not all, but most, so one of the facets of continuity that I mentioned were people who had advanced parts of this program without advancing all of it. And it's interesting that the majority of those people are Americans. And that merits more thought than I've given it, or can give it quickly now. And as a matter of fact, I'm simply not really a specialist of the American reception of Darwin. I've done a bit of work on it, despite being American. Done a bit of work on it. I want to do more. I have another little mini project going in that direction. But no, I haven't done that yet. And I think it's really interesting. So among other things, it would force you to spend some time dealing with, in the American context, dealing with paleontology, which is a huge part of the American uptake of evolution. And then the other thing that I want to say, because this is also important in the American context, the other thing that I want to say is it would make you deal with this on both sides of the Atlantic. And this I gestured at in the book, but I mean, this would have just been an immense field that I don't have time to think about. I think the most plausible interpretation of a full-on, honest-to-God Mendelian revolution is in agriculture. And that's a story that has been told some. So like Margavicelo has written some stuff on this that's really good. There's a few other people who've thought about agriculture and Mendelism. Wow, one who's sadly left the academy, Don Barry, was going to work on this stuff, but didn't find gainful employment. But anyway, that's a story. That's a story, because for all that the 19th century was indeed the era of the standardization of lots of agricultural varieties, that changed in 1900. And the shape of agricultural breeding work just simply is not the same after Mendel, and that I think is a darn fine candidate for a domain of thought that was revolutionarily altered. Now, how does that work out exactly? That story is largely that, as I understand it, and this is, again, I'm not a super spec, but I understand that's a William Bateson story. William Bateson, when he wants Mendelism to win, sure, he talks to the biologists a little bit. He talks to the biometricians a little bit. Really what he does is he goes and talks to all the breeders.
And remember that agriculture showed the hybrid effect, which was a contradiction with what the eugenists were defending of the pure race. So maybe we have more contacts between these two schools than we have thought.
Yeah, and that's interesting too. There's a funny wrinkle there, because of course also Pearson and Weldon were staunchly opposed to anything that looked like a pure gamete as well. So there's a funny because that's a Mendelian thing, right? To be able to say that you have a whatever purely green line of peas that will then, if it interbreeds, be purely green forever. Oh no, we can't have that if we're biometricians. So this all interacts in really interesting ways, and that agriculture story is just super interesting. And I every time I see a talk about it, I go and learn more and enjoy it, because that's a fun history.
Well, great. I think, unfortunately, we should finish because it's 11 p.m. for Charles. So I would like to thank him again, both for the availability to talk with us and for the time which allowed us to keep approximately our habituated time of meeting. So
thanks so much to all of you. There was a lot of time that you spent too. This was not a super fast book to read, so thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I'm so excited that you guys enjoyed it, and that this is actually one of the biggest ones of this talk that I gave. This was a great audience, so I really appreciate it. And next time, hopefully, I was in Sao Paulo when the ISH meeting was there, but I want an excuse to come back. So me and Joao are going to work on this. So next time with the caipirinha in hand. Yeah,
this will be great. We are looking forward to it.
Much appreciated. Thank you so much. Have a great one.
Bye, Charles. Bye,
Charles.
everybody. Thank you.
Everyone.